Welcome to the Archaeology Studio. Today's episode considers archaeology in the world's greatest role-playing game, Dungeons & Dragons. Archaeology has been a component of many fantasy adventure novels, movies, television series, and games. Moreover, these creations have influenced or cross-influenced each other, and therefore the role of archaeology has become integrated into the genre, and specifically into the game of Dungeons & Dragons, both directly and indirectly. In this video, I will share a few of my ideas about how archaeology can be represented accurately and how it can contribute productively in fictional campaign settings, in adventuring themes, and in story arcs. In a separate video, I will consider the possibilities of an archaeologist as a character in the fantasy adventure genre. At any time, if you can score a critical hit on the subscribe button and the notification bell, then you never will need to roll for another Constitution saving throw or investigation check for knowing about new videos in this channel. I upload new content at least once per month. Within the genre of fantasy adventure, archaeology can contribute in two major aspects. First, the concept of deep historical time can affect the fantasy setting itself. For example, in the way that J.R.R. Tolkien used a backstory of many thousands of years for creating the setting of Middle-earth. Second, the theme of an ancient mystery can link with the creative storylines and character motivations. For example, when searching for an ancient relic, or when chasing the clues of an ancient mystery. You may have noticed already that these aspects are particularly potent in the game of Dungeons & Dragons. The concept of deep historical time is consistent with the reality of thousands of years of the world's archaeological record, and it always applies, even though you may not notice it, whenever you do anything in the real world, as well as whenever you play a game of Dungeons & Dragons. Just like for us in our world, the characters in a fantasy adventure setting act within their world that already has been shaped by deep historical time that includes both natural and cultural history. Nevertheless, the details may not be exposed fully, and you would need to consider what aspects of the ancient past may or may not be relevant in your current setting. Often in Dungeons & Dragons, the characters will encounter an abandoned castle, a crumbling old tower, or a set of ancient ruins. The characters may not ever learn about when the site had been constructed, what kinds of activities occurred there, or what may have been involved in the site's eventual abandonment. An archaeologist surely would be compelled to investigate those issues, but the investigation probably would not be the top priority when the characters are fighting for their lives against a team of goblins, or battling a mad wizard who has seized control of the ancient site and repurposed it into a new base of operations. In the world of Dungeons & Dragons, ancient site ruins tend to be expected features in the landscape, in contrast to the reality in our modern world. Today, ancient site ruins have been preserved in specific instances, but mostly at a global scale they no longer function as parts of daily life. Rather, most of the world's ancient sites have been destroyed by urban developments, roads, and industries, notably after World War I and then especially after World War II. These factors in our modern world did not exist previously, and they certainly would not apply in a Dungeons & Dragons settings. Some hundreds of years ago, during the medieval period or during the Iron Age, people would expect to see ancient site ruins in the unoccupied localities, outside the major cities and roadways. Even within a city, at least a few of the buildings could be known for their deeper histories. Maybe some of the roads, bridges, and ports were constructed a long time ago, and they continued to be used, perhaps with modifications or remodeling episodes. In my view as an archaeologist, I would encourage to consider at least a little bit about the life history of a site, prior to the time frame of your Dungeons & Dragons encounter. Generally, I caution against indulging in too much detail of fantasy world building. Rather, you could consider 3 basic points, and you can evaluate how much detail may be relevant in your particular setting. First, how long ago was the site constructed? Second, what happened at this site in terms of its major purpose and activities? Third, what was the context of the eventual abandonment of the site? For the sake of illustration in this video, we can imagine an abandoned site on a remote hilltop in the wilderness. The characters need to accomplish an objective here. Maybe bandits are using the site ruins for a secret hiding place. Maybe a wicked necromancer has started to live here and raise an army of undead soldiers. Maybe the characters are searching for a sacred relic that seems to be associated with this ancient place. Regarding the age of this site, you do not need to pinpoint the number of years involved, but you should be able to evaluate if it was built approximately 20 years ago, 200 years ago, 1,000 years ago, or at some other approximate time range in the past. Within those parameters, could any living person still retain a direct memory or experience of the site? Could any historical information survive about the site, perhaps transformed into folklore, myths, or legends? The time range can be complicated in the game of Dungeons & Dragons because some characters could have lived for hundreds of years longer than an ordinary human lifespan. A site of 500 years old may seem incredibly ancient to some people, while it may seem inconsequential to others. If you can identify an approximate age of this site, then you could ascertain other aspects about it. Again, I would stress that you do not need to indulge in too much detail, but the key point here is to be aware of the major factors that can make your setting more realistic, more engaging, and ideally more suitable for your particular game setting. For example, the ruins of 100 years old could be mostly recognizable, but the ruins of 1,000 years old would be considerably more degraded and decayed. The components of wood, thatching, textiles, and organic debris mostly would have disintegrated after just a few decades, unless they had been preserved inside a stable, enclosed environment. After maybe 50 years, even the most durable timbers of cedarwood and redwood could start to decay if they were exposed to shifting conditions of wet, dry, hot, and cold. The most resilient elements of stone, metals, glass, and high-fired ceramic products would survive potentially for many thousands of years in exposed settings, but gradually they would have become weathered, damaged, probably disaggregated and dispersed, maybe burned in a fire, almost certainly overgrown with some form of vegetation, and likely buried, at least partially beneath sedimentary buildup and rubble. If this ancient site example is about 1,000 years old, then most likely only the stone and metal portions of the construction have survived, and those parts likely have been weathered and damaged. If the roof had been made of wood or thatch, then it no longer exists. If beams of timbers had supported a ceiling or second story, then those components probably have collapsed down to the ground level. Doors and windows have been disintegrated or broken. An iron gate or portcullis probably has become rusted into a fixed position, and it may have started to crumble in some parts. Almost everywhere, you would see patches of rubble, sediments, and vegetation growth mixed with the remnants of larger stonework features, broken glass, fragments of rusty metal, and bits of pottery. Depending on the age of this site, you might observe scattered bricks or roof tiles. Perhaps some portions of this ancient site were made entirely of stone, including the walls and ceiling. In this case, the heroic characters could enter into a classic enclosed dungeon with interior rooms and passageways. Generally speaking, these kinds of interior spaces would have remained overall more protected and stable than in the exterior spaces of the site. Additionally, vegetation growth would not have been possible without regular sunlight and water. One important implication here is that the characters would move through a site where the wooden doors may have disintegrated. The wood and textile furnishings likely have been burned or decayed, and glass windows probably have been broken. If someone had started to reuse the site ruins, then the characters should be able to notice the signs of foot traffic, cleared debris, maybe some reworking of the stone rubble, and perhaps a few newly installed furnishings. If you want to consider more details about the age of these site ruins, then I might suggest to think about the architectural design, technology, and engineering that may have changed through time. For instance, was the technology available to produce bricks and roof tiles? Was the stonework made with iron cutting tools, or was it made with a different kind of bronze technology, or perhaps without any metalworking technology? Was the stonework made with binding mortar, or was it dry stacked? Did the architects incorporate parts of the natural environment, such as rock outcroppings or caves? Was this place designed to withstand complicated siege weapons and machines, or was it made at a time when those possibilities did not yet exist? Next, you can consider what happened at this site during its ancient context. What was its original purpose, and what kinds of activities would have occurred here? For example, was this place a military garrison or outpost? Probably with thick walls, defensible positions, and practical utilities. If it was a military site, then what kinds of weapons technology and battle strategies and tactics were available at that ancient time? Was it a royal residence, with more lavish accoutrements and artistic outfitting? If it was a royal residence, then what was the political structure at 1,000 years ago, and how might those aspects be reflected in the site? Was it a temple, with emphasis on the rituals that were performed here? If it was a temple, then was the religion the same or different from the current situation? These general categories probably are more than sufficient for most Dungeons & Dragons game sessions, and then you could be more specific if your particular case calls for it. Regardless of the original purpose of a site, it must have accommodated a way for its occupants to access and store a supply of drinking water and food, plus a means for discarding the waste. Depending on the environmental setting and the time period, you might consider different options. For example, a hand-dug well without metal tools probably would be shaped like a crater and then lined with stonework. Maybe the level of the water table has changed over the last 1,000 years, or maybe the water level has changed in nearby rivers and lakes. In terms of the food supply at this 1,000-year-old site, the signs of an ancient farmland, orchard, or pasture may not be so clear anymore, except in the eyes of someone who has been trained to examine the patterns in vegetation growth, or to identify the remnants of old decayed fence lines. As for the waste management system, you probably still could identify the remains of 1,000-year-old sewer drains or tunnels, and you might be able to discern the places of the former rubbish piles or pits where trash was burned on a regular basis. I should mention that any site context must have involved a way for people to bury their dead or to treat the deceased through cremation, launching in a boat, hiding inside a sealed cave, or some other manner of mortuary practice. Knowing this potential diversity in mortuary practice, our example of a 1,000-year-old site may or may not have included unmarked graves in random locations, burial urns hidden inside caves, formal tombs beneath or outside ruined houses, perhaps a large designated cemetery, or some other format of mortuary ritual area. Additionally, in some cases, the surviving next generations of people may have maintained reliquaries of the bones, tools, jewelry, or other remembrances of the deceased. The past treatment of the dead carries special importance in Dungeons & Dragons because of the possibility of undead creatures and perhaps necromancers. Moreover, an ancient tomb just might be the resting place of an arcane relic or a unique clue that the characters are seeking in their adventure. Furthermore, when considering the past use of a site, I always encourage to think about the surrounding natural and social environment. Plus, I want to emphasize how this context may have changed through time. In our example of a hilltop site, was it indeed a hilltop at 1,000 years ago? Or did something change in tectonic movement, the degree of slope erosion and redeposition, or other factors of the environment? At 1,000 years ago, where could people have found stable landforms for building their primary constructions that would avoid being eroded down a slope or flooded by a river? Where could they have found their vital water sources? And where could they have grown their food supplies? Were those people concerned about defensive positions, secret escape routes, networks of guard towers, or other issues? During the course of 1,000 years, the landforms and habitat ecologies likely transformed to some degree, for example, due to changing climate, fluctuating sea level, crazed wizards striking each other with meteor swarms, ambitious dwarves mining too deep into the earth and causing catastrophic collapse, fierce giants locked in epic battles of mass destruction, or ancient dragons who died and released their magical essence into the land itself. In the world of Dungeons & Dragons, you do not need to be limited to standard scientific explanations of long-term environmental or social change, but at least some knowledge can go a long way toward creating a realistic setting. In this case, the realism does not need to equate with every detail of our modern scientific knowledge. Rather, the principle of verisimilitude should be respected, meaning that the fantasy world system is consistent and believable within itself. One more basic aspect about an ancient site involves what happened when it was abandoned. In our example in this video, a hilltop site was constructed 1,000 years ago. But when did people stop using it? Could the site have been remodeled or reused, perhaps 2 or 3 times? In this respect, the most important point is about whether or not the site includes a single construction episode and layer of occupation versus the possibility of multiple episodes and layers. In a game of Dungeons & Dragons, the characters may not need to know why a site was abandoned at a certain time. The bottom line is that the site must have become unusable for one reason or another. I already mentioned a few possibilities of how the environment may have transformed and thereby rendered a site unsustainable for a population. You might consider other possibilities as well, such as an invading army, a plague, an earthquake, or a fire. A catastrophic ending of a site often would create a diagnostic signature of a major calamity and sudden termination of the use of a site. This option could create a sense of intrigue about patterns of scorch marks, impressions of gargantuan claw strikes, a coating of fine ash all over a site, a massive layer of beach sand and broken seashells, or strange-looking mushrooms growing in the dark and damp corners. Otherwise, in most cases, after some hundreds of years later, the end result is an abandoned ancient ruin, and the precise reasons for the site abandonment may not be discernible unless your characters deliberately investigate the site. As I have presented so far in this video, at least some knowledge or appreciation of archaeology in general can enhance the way that you design and describe individual encounters or environments in Dungeons & Dragons. The amount of details would depend on what you evaluate as relevant and helpful in your particular case. For example, do the characters need to know that the ground surface is covered with a 9 centimeter thick layer of light yellowish brown gravelly silt? Or will the characters be okay with a description of loose dirt and rubble? Do the characters need to know that a site was constructed 984 years ago? Or would they be satisfied with estimating an age of nearly 1,000 years ago? Beyond the technical descriptions of sites and environments, archaeology potentially can link with adventuring themes and concepts in Dungeons & Dragons. Especially if your campaign involves ancient relics and mysteries, then you might consider more about what I presented here, regarding how the world can change through long timescales. If your campaign requires the characters to find an ancient relic or solve an arcane mystery, then you might find some creative inspiration in the archaeologist background for at least one character. An archaeologist could be an active heroic character in the game, or a contributing non-player character as either a protagonist or antagonist in the story. I will address those issues in the next video episode. I would be happy to prepare more videos about how archaeology can relate with Dungeons & Dragons, and generally with the fantasy adventure genre. If you want for me to address something specific, then please alert me in the comment section of this video. Additionally, I am curious to know your thoughts and how you might explore further with these ideas. Please remember to subscribe to this channel, tell your friends about it, and see new videos every month with the Archaeology Studio.